No one in the room understood why Amelia Carter stayed so calm when the lounge manager pointed toward the door and announced that her credential was not valid. A few travelers smirked as a security officer stepped forward, while Amelia simply held her worn leather folder a little closer to her chest. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not mention any title or threaten to call a lawyer. But the moment she crossed the threshold and stepped back into the crowded terminal, the airport director himself, a tall gray-haired man named Jackson Reed, walked around the corner, saw a small silver badge slip from her folder and stopped cold in front of dozens of witnesses. Then, without a word of explanation to anyone watching, he stood at attention and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. If you want to know why a quiet single mother once brought an entire airport lounge to silence, stay with this story until the very end. The truth of that moment began forming nearly 40 minutes earlier, on an ordinary Monday morning at Hawthorne International Airport when the terminal was already thick with rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and the low hum of 1,000 people trying to be somewhere else. Amelia arrived alone with no driver, no assistant, and no entourage trailing behind her, only a small carry-on case, a laptop bag, and an old brown leather folder that looked like it had survived more than a few years of hard use. She was 38 years old, dressed simply in dark slacks and a plain blazer, the kind of quiet, unremarkable outfit that made her easy to overlook in a terminal filled with expensive suits and designer luggage. At home, her young daughter was staying with a relative for the 2 days Amelia would be away, and though the story would never place the child inside the airport itself, it mattered that Amelia was raising her alone, carrying both a career and a household on the same two shoulders. She was not traveling for a vacation or a routine work trip. She had been personally invited by the Hawthorne Airport Authority to attend a closed hearing in Washington on emergency response systems used at major airports across the country, and the invitation itself had come directly from the office of Jackson Reed, a former Air Force colonel who now ran the entire airport as its director. In the confirmation email his office had sent her, Amelia had been granted temporary access to the executive VIP lounge while she waited for her connecting flight, a small courtesy extended to outside consultants brought in for sensitive briefings, and she had thought nothing more of it than any other line of paperwork in a long week. What Amelia did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that the lounge's membership system had been upgraded the night before, and that several of the special access credentials issued directly by the airport authority had not yet synced into the scanner sitting at the lounge entrance. When she reached the desk and presented her boarding pass along with the authorization code from her invitation letter, the small screen blinked back 2 words in red: "Access not found." The young woman at the reception counter was polite enough, asking Amelia to wait a moment while she checked with a supervisor, and Amelia, unbothered, simply opened the email on her phone and explained that her access had been granted directly through the airport director's office. It was at that exact moment that Madison Blake, the lounge's 43-year-old manager, came striding around the corner, freshly rattled from handling a demanding group of corporate travelers and bracing herself for an incoming delegation of airline executives she was determined to impress. Madison's eyes moved over Amelia in a single practice sweep, taking in the plain blazer, the absence of a designer bag, the lack of a platinum membership card, the complete absence of anything that in Madison's mind signaled importance, and within seconds she had already reached her conclusion. She assumed, without asking a single real question, that this was simply another traveler trying to talk her way into a lounge using a screenshot of an email that could belong to anyone. Amelia remained steady, her voice even, and suggested that Madison simply call the director's office to confirm the access herself, a request that should have taken less than 2 minutes to resolve the entire misunderstanding. Madison did not make the call. That single decision, made out of impatience and a rising line of travelers behind them, would become the first domino in everything that followed, and Madison looked down at the words "office" of the airport director glowing on Amelia's phone screen and said, with a coldness that surprised even the receptionist beside her, that anyone could create an email that looked official. Amelia tried again, calmly explaining that she was not asking for anything beyond what had already been formally granted to her, but Madison's patience had already run out, and the line behind them had grown long enough that other travelers were beginning to crane their necks to see what the delay was about. Rather than pulling Amelia aside for a quiet private verification, which any well-trained manager would have done in seconds, Madison chose instead to raise her voice just enough for the growing crowd to hear every word, announcing that the VIP lounge existed for qualified guests and not for anyone holding up a photograph of an email on their phone. A few heads turned. A man near the coffee station let out a short, mocking laugh. Amelia understood, in that instant, that what should have been a private administrative hiccup was quickly becoming a public spectacle, yet she kept her voice level and reached into her folder for the physical documents she had brought as backup. The official envelope from the Hawthorne Airport Authority, containing her formal invitation letter, her boarding authorization, a temporary consultant credential, and the direct contact information for a coordinator named Grace Miller in the director's office. Madison barely glanced at the papers. The credential inside did not resemble the familiar plastic lounge membership cards she scanned dozens of times a day, and rather than checking the authorization number printed clearly across the top, she simply declared that it held no value at that particular lounge. Amelia asked quietly but directly whether Madison had actually entered the authorization number into her system, and Madison offered no real answer at all, instead instructing Amelia to step out of the line so other guests could be helped. A well-dressed man nearby sighed loudly at the delay. A woman 2 places back looked uncomfortable but said nothing, and the unspoken rule of public spaces held everyone in place, no one willing to be the person who spoke up first. Connor Hayes, the 46-year-old head of VIP security, was called over by Madison, who told him she had a guest attempting to use an invalid credential, and though Connor's first glance at the official airport authority seal on the documents told him something did not add up, his suggestion to simply call and confirm was waved away by Madison, who insisted she had handled situations exactly like this dozens of times before. Amelia heard that particular sentence and looked at Madison for a moment longer than before, not with anger, but with the quiet, measured attention of someone accustomed to watching a process fail in real time before it turns into something worse, a habit built over years of standing in rooms where ignoring a small warning sign had once cost lives. Madison made her decision. Amelia would have to leave the lounge immediately, and if she refused, security would escort her out. Connor's expression suggested he did not fully agree, but without documented proof to challenge his own manager in front of watching guests, he had little room to push back in that moment. Amelia gathered her folder without protest, and as she turned to walk away, she said only that she had asked Madison to verify her credentials 3 separate times. Madison's reply was sharp and final. She had told Amelia 3 times that she did not belong there. As Amelia tucked the papers back into her bag, the corner of an old silver badge slipped loose and caught the light for just a second, and Connor, standing closer than anyone else, saw the shape of a pair of wings stamped into the metal and felt something tighten in his chest. Connor asked, almost without thinking, what exactly the badge was, and Amelia slid it quickly back into her folder, offering only a brief, unbothered answer that it was something from an old job, nothing more. She had no intention of revealing anything further, not to defend herself, and not to change anyone's mind in that moment, and her restraint only fed Madison's suspicion rather than easing it. Madison, watching the exchange, decided that Amelia was now trying to imply some kind of federal or military authority to pressure them into reversing their decision, and she warned, loudly enough for nearby staff to hear, that impersonating an official credential could carry serious consequences. The words landed differently than anything said before them, because now Amelia was no longer simply being denied entry to a lounge. Her integrity itself was being questioned in front of strangers, and she turned back one final time to say, very clearly, that she had never claimed to be anyone at all. Connor, to his credit, agreed that Amelia had never once used the badge to demand special treatment, but Madison still instructed him to walk her out, and Amelia did not resist. As Connor escorted her through the terminal, Amelia's phone buzzed in her pocket, a call from Grace Miller lighting up the screen, but caught in the middle of a tense, quiet walk she did not want to turn into a shouting match over the phone. She let it go to voicemail. On the other side of the terminal, inside the director's administrative wing, Grace was already in a small panic, having just discovered that Amelia's lounge access had never synced into the new system overnight. She tried calling the lounge directly, but the front desk was too busy to answer, so she rushed instead to find Jackson Reed, who was walking toward a scheduled meeting with the airport's board of directors when Grace caught up to him, breathless, telling him there had been a report of a guest turned away from the lounge over an invalid credential. Jackson stopped walking. When Grace said the guest's name was Amelia Carter, something shifted behind his eyes, and he asked, in a voice suddenly much quieter than before, exactly where she was right now. Grace explained that the lounge staff had flagged the credential as suspicious, and Jackson asked one more question, whether anyone had actually read the name printed on it. And when Grace confirmed they likely had not, Jackson turned on his heel and changed direction immediately, leaving the board meeting behind without a second thought. Inside the lounge, Madison had already begun recounting the incident to a coworker, proud of herself for having, in her words, stopped someone from using questionable paperwork to sneak into a restricted area. Connor, increasingly uneasy with how quickly the entire situation had unfolded, returned to his own security terminal and typed in the authorization code that Madison had never bothered to check herself. The screen took a few seconds to load, and then 2 lines appeared that made his stomach drop. Authorized Airport Director's Office, followed directly beneath by a second line reading Special Security Consultant, Priority Clearance. Connor stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over, but by then Amelia had already been walked out through the main doors of the lounge and into the open terminal beyond. Just as Connor reached for his radio to call Madison back, Jackson Reed appeared at the far end of the corridor with Grace hurrying beside him, and the moment his eyes landed on Amelia, they dropped instantly to something small and silver that had just slipped free from her folder and hit the floor between them. The badge landed with a soft, almost silent clatter, and Jackson bent down to pick it up himself before anyone else could reach it. Stamped across its surface was the emblem of an old Air Force unit, and beneath it, engraved in small, precise letters, the name Amelia Carter. He held it in his palm for a moment, and the years fell away from him all at once. 7 years earlier, Jackson had still been a colonel overseeing a joint military and civilian aviation coordination unit, back when a military transport aircraft suffered a critical control malfunction while attempting to land during a violent storm that had swallowed the airfield whole. Dozens of service members and relief workers were aboard that aircraft, and on the ground, a young major named Amelia Carter, responsible for emergency ground coordination that night, noticed a crosswind reading that the automated landing system was interpreting incorrectly. The order from her superiors was to proceed with the original landing approach exactly as planned. Amelia refused to simply follow along. She insisted the runway be closed, that the aircraft be redirected to a different approach entirely, and she accepted full personal risk of disciplinary action if her judgment turned out to be wrong. She had not been wrong. Within minutes, a piece of ground equipment was torn loose by the wind and thrown directly onto the very runway the aircraft had originally been cleared to use, and had the plane landed there as ordered, the outcome would very likely have been catastrophic for everyone aboard. Jackson had been standing in the command center that night, and he had never forgotten the young officer who chose the safety of strangers over the comfort of following orders that felt safer for her own career. Standing now in the middle of a crowded terminal 7 years later, he returned the badge to Amelia's hand, straightened his posture, and in front of every stunned onlooker in the lounge, the former colonel and current airport director performed a slow, formal military salute, not because regulation demanded it of him, and not because Amelia outranked him in any official sense anymore, but because it was the simple, unhesitating respect one soldier owes another who once chose to save lives at the cost of her own comfort. Amelia, caught completely off guard, straightened instinctively out of old habit and offered a small, quiet nod in return. Every person who had watched her walked out of that lounge minutes earlier now stood frozen in silence, and Madison, standing near the entrance, felt the color drain from her face. Jackson asked her directly, using her old rank without thinking, why Major Carter had been standing outside his own lounge. Amelia corrected him gently, noting that it was former Major now, and Jackson only smiled and told her that, to him, nothing about what she had done had changed simply because of a title. He turned to Madison next, and though she immediately tried to explain that the scanner had failed to recognize the credential, Jackson did not raise his voice. He asked, calmly and directly, whether she had called his office to confirm. Madison had no answer. He asked whether she had entered the authorization code herself. Again, silence. Connor stepped forward with his tablet already open, showing the confirmation screen along with security footage that had recorded, with sound, 3 separate moments where Amelia had asked for verification and been refused. What had begun as a simple technical misunderstanding had, in the span of a few minutes, revealed itself as something far more troubling about how people were being treated. Jackson looked over the footage once, then said only that computers can make mistakes, but procedures exist precisely so a mistake does not turn into humiliation. Before Madison could offer anything close to an apology, Grace leaned in close to Jackson's ear and told him quietly that Amelia had not come to Hawthorne only to catch a connecting flight, that the file she was carrying in her bag was tied directly to the very lounge they were standing in. What Grace meant became clear only a few minutes later, once the group had moved into a small conference room away from the crowded terminal, and the second layer of the story began to unfold. Amelia was not a secret inspector sent to test the lounge in disguise, nor was she, in some overly convenient twist, secretly the owner of the airport itself. She was exactly who she appeared to be, a traveler heading to Washington for a legitimate hearing, but the folder she carried held something the airport authority had commissioned from her 3 months earlier. Amelia had built a career after leaving the military as a specialist in what aviation professionals call human factor failures, the kind of breakdowns that occur not because of broken machinery, but because trained staff quietly ignore procedure whenever pressure, bias, or overconfidence convinces them they already know the right answer. Hawthorne was in the middle of recertifying its systems for handling special access passengers and emergency situations, and several recent internal reports had shown a troubling pattern of staff skipping verification steps whenever they felt certain enough in their own judgment. Amelia had come carrying a preliminary version of that very assessment, and the irony was not lost on anyone in the room. What had just happened to her in the lounge was a textbook example of the exact problem she had been hired to study. Even so, Amelia did not use the moment to seek revenge. When Jackson asked whether she wanted Madison suspended immediately, Amelia answered simply that they should look at the footage first, a request that revealed far more about her character than any badge ever could. She had no interest in costing someone their job over a personal insult. She wanted to know whether what had happened to her was an isolated lapse in judgment or a symptom of something larger running through the entire lounge operation. Connor pulled the full recording, and it showed everything plainly. Amelia presenting her email, Madison refusing to check it, Amelia handing over the authorization code, Madison never entering it, Connor suggesting a call to the director's office, and Madison shutting the idea down each time. More damning still was an earlier clip from that same morning, showing Madison waving through a different traveler, a businessman whose credential had also failed the scanner, simply because he was dressed expensively and claimed, without any verification at all, to be a platinum-level executive member. Grace pulled the membership logs from that same morning to compare the two encounters side by side, and the contrast was stark enough that even Madison's closest colleagues in the room fell quiet while it played out on the screen. The businessman had been waved through in under 30 seconds, offered a chilled glass of water and a seat by the window before he had even finished stating his name. Amelia, by comparison, had been kept standing at the counter for nearly 6 minutes, questioned twice, and ultimately walked out past a line of watching strangers. The problem was no longer a single computer error. 2 travelers had triggered the exact same failure, yet one had been welcomed inside without a second thought while the other had been publicly escorted out. Jackson made no accusation about Madison's private motives, but the inconsistency in how the same procedure had been applied was impossible to ignore. When pressed, Madison tried to explain that the businessman had simply looked more trustworthy, and the instant the words left her mouth, she seemed to hear them herself and understand exactly how damaging they sounded. Amelia looked at her steadily and said that this was precisely why these procedures existed in the first place. Not to protect important guests from ordinary ones, but to protect everyone from decisions made on nothing more than a feeling. Jackson instructed Grace to preserve every relevant camera file and access log and formally opened an internal investigation, though rather than firing Madison on the spot in a moment of dramatic satisfaction, he simply removed her from active lounge management while the review proceeded, a decision far closer to how such matter actually unfold inside a real organization. Connor, continuing to dig through the access logs late into the review, uncovered something that made the entire picture far more serious. Over the previous 6 months, 17 separate cases showed valid credentials being denied by lounge management without the required verification step ever being performed, and 14 of those 17 cases carried the same digital signature: Madison Blake. The formal review took place later that afternoon in a small meeting room near the lounge, and Jackson made a deliberate choice not to let Amelia serve as any kind of decision-maker in the process, since she was too directly involved in what had happened to be seen as neutral. Amelia offered only a factual statement about her own experience and stepped back to let Connor and the compliance team work through the 17 flagged cases on their own. Some of the incidents turned out to have reasonable explanations behind them, minor errors anyone might make under pressure, but a disturbing number did not. There was an elderly traveler who had been turned away without cause, a government employee carrying a special credential who had been dismissed outright, a guest personally invited by a partner airline who had been sent away at the door. In nearly every troubling case, the same pattern repeated itself. Madison had decided, often within seconds, that the person in front of her simply did not look like someone who belonged in a VIP lounge, and she had skipped the verification step accordingly. The story never tried to paint Madison as some cartoonish villain twirling a mustache behind the front desk. Through her own statement, it became clear that she had once been praised for reducing lounge fraud during an earlier period at Hawthorne, and that early praise had slowly hardened into an unshakable confidence in her own ability to read people at a glance. Confidence had curdled into bias over time, bias had calcified into habit, and habit had spent years hiding comfortably behind the word experience. Jackson summarized it plainly for the room, saying that the most dangerous systems are rarely the ones staffed by cruel people. They are the ones that quietly allow a single person to believe their own judgment matters more than the process everyone agreed to follow. Amelia listened to those words and thought back, almost involuntarily, to the storm 7 years earlier, to the night she had stood her ground against a superior officer because the data in front of her told a different story than the order she had been given. Status had never been the thing that proved anyone right on that runway. Evidence had. Madison was eventually brought into the room herself, and whatever pride had carried her through the morning had clearly drained away by then. She apologized to Amelia, though her first attempt still carried a faint trace of self-protection in it, framed around not having realized who Amelia truly was. Amelia looked at her for a long moment before answering with what would become the most important line of the entire encounter, telling Madison that she still did not understand, that Amelia had never needed anyone to recognize who she was, only to be treated correctly even if she had turned out to be no one important at all. The room went completely silent after that. It was a sentence that resolved the entire meaning of the story without depending on Amelia's military past for its weight, and something in Madison's expression finally shifted, as if she were hearing the real problem clearly for the first time. She apologized once more, and this time there was no mention of badges, titles, or airport directors in it at all, only an honest acknowledgement of what she had actually done wrong. Jackson then laid out the preliminary outcome. Madison would be suspended pending a full formal investigation, with any further personnel decisions to be handled properly through human resources and compliance based on the complete record, rather than settled dramatically on the spot in front of an audience. Amelia rose to leave not long after, mindful of the flight still waiting for her, but Jackson stopped her at the door, telling her there was one more thing she did not yet know. The Washington hearing she was flying toward was not only going to review her written report on emergency systems, he explained. The airport authority had already put her name forward for something entirely new. Jackson revealed that Hawthorne, alongside 3 other major airports, was in the process of forming a National Passenger Safety Advisory Board, a body created specifically to examine incidents where human error, bias, commercial pressure, or simple procedural breakdown had the potential to put real safety at risk. He had personally recommended Amelia for a seat on that board weeks earlier, long before anything that had happened that morning, and he made a point of telling her plainly that this had nothing to do with pity over how she had been treated in the lounge. It rested entirely on her military record, her safety history, and the years of careful consulting work she had built since leaving the service. Amelia was genuinely caught off guard by the news. Since retiring from the Air Force, she had deliberately avoided larger, more visible roles, choosing instead a quieter path after her husband's death left her raising their daughter alone, favoring independent consulting work precisely because it let her control her own schedule and stay close to home. Jackson understood that without needing it explained to him. He did not push or pressure her toward any decision. He only told her that the ability to notice what other people overlook had already saved lives once before, and that it was still doing exactly that today, whether or not she chose to accept a formal title for it. Amelia did not give him an answer right away, and the story was careful not to reward her simply by handing her power the moment she had been mistreated, because she had already possessed the very competence everyone in that lounge had failed to see. The incident had only forced people to finally notice what had been true about her all along. She told Jackson she would think about it seriously on the flight to Washington, and asked only one thing in return: that whatever decision came out of the board's work, it lead to real changes in how ordinary staff were trained rather than another framed document hung quietly on a wall somewhere. Jackson agreed without hesitation, telling her that was precisely the reason he had put her name forward in the first place, because she had never once, in all the years he had known of her work, mistaken a policy binder for an actual solution. Before heading toward her gate, she stopped back at the lounge briefly to collect a folder Grace had accidentally left behind, and several of the travelers who had witnessed the earlier scene recognized her immediately. One man half rose from his seat, offering her what he clearly considered the best chair in the entire lounge, but Amelia declined with a small, genuine smile and chose an ordinary seat near a window instead, no different from any other traveler waiting for a flight. Connor approached her quietly to apologize for not stopping the situation sooner, and Amelia told him he had done exactly the right thing at the moment that mattered most, the instant he noticed something felt wrong and chose to check the data instead of protecting his own position or his manager's authority. That instinct, she told him, was precisely the kind of behavior any safety-conscious system should be trying to encourage in its people. A young staff member, still visibly shaken by everything that had unfolded that morning, quietly asked Amelia about the badge, and for the first time all day she offered a real answer, explaining briefly that it was not some medal handed out for never feeling afraid. Courage, she told the young woman, was usually nothing more dramatic than the simple decision to check something one more time, right when everyone around you was ready to keep moving forward without a second thought. At the boarding gate, Jackson appeared once more, though this time there was no salute, no formality, only two old colleagues shaking hands the way people do when a long, strange day has finally settled into something manageable. He told her that Washington was waiting for her. Amelia smiled and replied that Washington could wait a little longer, but her flight certainly could not, a small, lighter moment before the story moved toward its final turn. As she stepped through the jet bridge doors moments later, her phone lit up with a message from Grace, informing her that the board had already read her report and wanted her to open their hearing the following morning. 3 weeks later, Hawthorne released the findings of its internal investigation. Madison was not fired in some dramatic, satisfying instance simply because of one embarrassing encounter with Amelia Carter. The full record instead showed a repeated pattern of skipped verification and inconsistent standards applied across many different travelers over many months. She was removed permanently from her position managing the VIP lounge and required to complete a full retraining program before she would be considered eligible for any future supervisory role within the airport. More importantly, Hawthorne overhauled its entire system in response to what the investigation had uncovered. Every credential issued directly by the airport authority was integrated straight into the lounge scanners themselves, and whenever the system flagged an error going forward, staff were now required to complete a mandatory second verification step that no manager, regardless of seniority or personal judgment, was permitted to bypass. Every denied access request now had to be logged with a documented reason attached to it. Connor was invited to join a newly formed process improvement team, recognized specifically because he had been the one person willing to check the actual authorization data instead of simply trusting assumptions handed down by someone above him. Grace was promoted into a newly created compliance liaison role between the director's office and every customer-facing team in the terminal, tasked specifically with making sure a gap like the one that had swallowed Amelia's credential could never again go unnoticed overnight. Connor's team ran a full audit of every access system in the building, not only the VIP lounge, and found smaller versions of the same problem quietly buried in 3 other departments, each one corrected long before it could produce a morning like the one Amelia had endured. Amelia accepted a part-time seat on the National Passenger Safety Advisory Board, on the condition that her schedule would still allow her to be present for her daughter's life at home, and true to her nature, she never let the position define how she carried herself. After her very first session with the board, she called home on a video chat, and when her daughter asked how the trip had gone, Amelia answered simply that it had been a rather long day at the airport. She did not mention that an entire lounge full of strangers had laughed at her that morning. She did not mention that the airport's own director had once stood at attention and saluted her in front of dozens of witnesses. That was not the lesson she wanted her daughter to carry away from any of it. What she wanted her to understand instead was something far simpler. A person's worth does not begin only once someone powerful finally chooses to notice it. Several months later, Amelia returned to Hawthorne for an unrelated meeting and found herself walking past the very same executive lounge where everything had first unfolded. An elderly traveler near the entrance was having some trouble with his credential, the scanner apparently flashing an error just as it had for her that morning long ago. But this time a young staff member behind the counter did not judge him and did not send him away. She simply asked him to wait one moment while she verified the issue properly, calm and unhurried, treating the small delay as nothing more than a routine step rather than an inconvenience to be brushed aside. Amelia stood a short distance away, unnoticed, no one in the terminal aware of who she was or what had once happened to her in that exact spot. No one saluted her. No one recognized the small silver badge resting quietly somewhere deep inside her bag. She simply watched for a moment, then allowed herself a small, quiet smile before continuing on her way, because that unremarkable little moment of ordinary decency was in the end the only victory that had ever really mattered to her. On the day Jackson Reed raised his hand and saluted Amelia Carter, the entire VIP lounge finally understood who she had once been. But on the day a complete stranger was treated with simple fairness without anyone needing a badge, a title, or a reputation to earn it, Amelia finally understood that Hawthorne had become exactly what she had always hoped it could be.